Welcome to Why I Quit, a show that interviews people quitting their 9-to-5 jobs in search of something different. Listen to inspiring conversations where we dive deep into the stories of why people quit their jobs, what were the hardest parts, where are they now, and any advice for people following the same path. I am so excited to introduce Ian Sharman as this week's guest. Listen to Ian share his story of becoming obsessed with running and how he became the youngest member to join the club of completing 100 marathons. Learn how he quit his job as an economist at Deloitte to pursue a full-time career as a professional runner and coach in the ultramarathon industry. Get inspired hearing stories of Ian traveling across the world completing 100-mile races while growing an online business at the same time. Thanks so much for joining us today, Ian. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
To start off, I want to go back a little bit. Tell me about where you grew up.
Yeah, so I come from the UK. I basically moved to the US about 11 years ago, basically to get married. So when I was 29. But I grew up and lived not in London. I lived in London for about 7 years when I was working in a corporate job, but I come from the middle of the country there. Yeah, I was working the first few years in London. It was something that I, enjoyed in general. The type of work I was doing wasn't a bad job. I was an economist. Working at a big company, Deloitte, but it wasn't something I was passionate about. And then when I moved over to the US, the easiest way to do visas and stuff is basically to move in the same company. So I was doing a slightly different type of role there that was more tax-based and was like the mostly boring and horrible job I've ever done. So it rapidly got me thinking about what else I could do, especially as soon as my green card arrived, basically. In fact, it was almost the day after I got my green card, I started putting in my notice and planning for other stuff.
So as you got started at Deloitte, did you see yourself as a career company man, or were you always thinking of like different ideas or, different paths?
I always assumed I'd work for myself at some point. I had no idea how that would work, but my dad is self-employed, and so he made that move probably in his about 50 years old, 40, 50 years old, so not that much older than I am now. But he started his own business. He's a financial advisor, and so he'd had the same job and then just did it himself. I changed fields completely, but I always assumed that would be a possible thing. And especially living in the Bay Area, which is where I was initially in the US, it's such an innovative place. You've got everyone is in a startup or they have their plans and their gigs on the side. And so you just see so much of that. And the work I was doing was specifically around intellectual property and these big tech companies doing various things. So when you're surrounded by that, it just becomes a natural thought that you can do your own thing. So it definitely gives you the opportunity to start thinking beyond maybe the limits. If everyone around you is doing the same job as you, and this is often the case in a lot of jobs, most of the people you're going to know are in the same company or in a similar field or in the same town and they have a normal job. It's harder to break away from the mindset that you have a job that someone else has organized for you. While being in that environment definitely opened my mind a little bit. As
you're starting to think about like different ideas, do you have anything on the side at this point, or are you just brainstorming about different avenues that you can get into?
Well, it fitted in with getting some running results. So the business I have now is an international endurance coaching business for runners. But at the time, I was just starting to get some results. So it also coincided, my green card arrived right after I got a major win and I got my first sponsors. So my initial thought was, I hate this job so much, I've got to do something related to running. And maybe I can just be a pro athlete for a while and find out other things that I could do there. And I actually aimed to do some kind of finance related role within one of my sponsors, North Face at the time. But that didn't pan out. So I was forced to think a little bit more broadly than that. But there was a plan. It wasn't just a case of I'm packing it all in and I have no idea what I'll do next. It wasn't a million miles from that, but it was definitely an idea of, okay, well, this running thing, let's see where that goes because I enjoy that a lot more. I now don't have to worry about the job just to be in the country. And so it gave me the opportunity at that point. I didn't have kids, didn't have a mortgage. So there's a bit more flexibility.
From when you started thinking about it, what do you think the time frame was? Did you have like a 6-month window or a year window where you're like, was it all based on the green card, or did you have like a specific financial idea in mind of like, I need to save this much and then the goal is to jump in from there?
It was more a case of I had some savings, not a whole lot, but enough that I could afford that first year to be testing things out, basically. And then after that, I knew I could always go back to the same career. So there was a fallback that I knew I could do the same job if I didn't want to have to do that, but it would always be an option. So there wasn't a huge amount of risk, but I really didn't want that to be the case. So it wasn't like, oh, well, I'll just try it and half-ass things and find out if it happens. It was all in to see what else I could do. And then after the first few weeks, I had friends of mine asking if I could give them advice and coach them. So I started looking into that avenue, getting some qualifications. I'd spent years trying to learn for myself anyway. So it wasn't like I was starting from a base of zero. I got to the point of being basically a professional athlete. So I'd gained a lot of experience and knew what had worked in my own experience and what had worked for Olympians and things like that. So there was a good number of years already of foundational work there for being a coach. But there's still a learning curve for doing that more formally, doing it as a business, having to do all the aspects of the business rather than just you're doing a job and that's the bit you do, and maybe you do a little bit of marketing here, you do a little bit of hiring here or there. This is then doing everything yourself, the website. So you have to become your own IT department, all those things that, to be honest, I found quite enjoyable, and especially coming from a business background, the idea of running a business, but having complete control and having all of the upside as well as the downside. But, you're definitely optimistic, the upside that if you gain $100,000 of revenue, then it's all yours. It's not just the company gives you a small bonus at the end of the year and says, thank you for that extra money.
As you're making the leap, do you have doubt in your head, or are you just pretty confident that you think you can find a way to make it work?
I was confident I could find something. It took a little bit of feeling around, asking a couple of companies if I could work within their environment first before I realized it had to be my own thing. But also, I'm in an environment now where ultra running is still quite a small niche sport. It just means running distance beyond the marathon, and particularly 100-miling racing being the big thing. But I know a lot of people who basically are self-employed within that, but usually within the context of living in a van and coaching a couple of people and having a bit of sponsorship money. So it's not so much a long-term strategy. Well, what I was thinking of is I need this to be a job for life, not just I can run well for a couple of years and scrape by then, but that I need something that takes the place of a corporate career and gives me stability to retirement, basically. So I was very much thinking of it as a business proposition, not just how can I do something I like doing for now.
And was the goal to experiment with different avenues like coaching and other things to throw it at the wall and see what would stick and then double down from there?
Basically, yeah. So there's been several different things I've done along the way, some degree of race directing, coaching side of things, just being a sponsored athlete. So it's just trying to see which of these work out, which of them are more time consuming or don't seem to be viable. And the coaching is the thing that stuck and that has built up over time. But it was definitely a case of having several different revenue streams there rather than just saying, I'm all in on this one thing and I hope it works. And if not, I'll rethink. It was, I need to be involved in anything that could give me a living in this industry that I love, and then see which bits of it last for the long term.
I want to go back a little bit. How did you get involved in trail running and ultra marathons?
I basically saw a TV show when I was working in London. So I was 24 years old, saw a TV show about a race in the Sahara Desert called the Marathon de Sable, which is 150 miles over 7 days in different stages. And I've always loved travel. So I had a gap year before university. Each summer at university, I would go away. I did my dissertation in India, spending a month there before my final year. And then and I studied economics. So, that was the side of things I was always coming from. And then I got into running after about 3 years of being in London because I'd always been an outdoorsy, sporty person, but I couldn't do things as easily there. And I found that I just wasn't being as healthy as I normally would be. It's a heavy drinking culture. You just go out and then each weekend blurs into the next weekend. Much as that was kind of fun, it didn't feel like it was the way I wanted to do things forever. And so running and seeing this TV show just made me think, okay, well, that's something I can do that I have complete control over, that I don't need to organize all these other people to turn up and book a pitch. I can just put my shoes on, fit it in any day of the week, and just found that over the first few years, I started to have more success and got better to the point that about 5 or 6 years in, I was able to get some sponsorship for it.
Tell me about that first race. Like, how long was it and what was the most you had run up to that point?
First one was a half marathon, so 13 miles. And that was about 3 months after I started training. And I had a friend who was a distance runner. He'd done quite a lot at university. So, at this point, we're both just a few years out of university. So it wasn't that long in advance of that he'd been doing it. And he was also training for this desert race. And we had 18 months to train for it. So we started off with a half marathon just outside of London. That went pretty well. I mean, it was definitely a learning curve. And the first time I ever ran 13 miles in training, everything ached. And then I had a marathon a couple of months later. And then those first 4 years, I actually ended up doing over 100, or just over 4 years, do 100 marathons or ultras. So I was doing pretty much every other weekend once I got going. So the first few months was not a huge amount of racing, but then once I did the first marathon, it was quite full on, and I found that my body reacted quite well to it and that I had a propensity towards this.
And so were you self-taught and self-training? Did you have a coach or a mentor that kind of helped you along the way?
100% self-taught. I had a running club, so I could ask some friends there, but it was more focused on marathons and below. There was a small group of just a few of us that did some ultras, and that's become much bigger now. But that was the biggest running club in London, so it's something like 3,000 people that are members, called Serpentine Running Club. So I got to know people through that, plus through racing. But really, it was a lot of trial and error, reading training manuals and reading people particularly who coached Olympic marathoners, because that was what most of the research and the writing was about. And there wasn't a whole lot written about the stuff beyond the marathon. So there was definitely trial and error in there as well.
What was it that made you so passionate about it?
I just enjoyed the fact I was getting better. So I never thought I'd make a living out of it. In fact, the first time I did a marathon, I didn't think I'd join the 100 Marathon Club, which I ended up being a member of at the time, the youngest member they'd ever had. I think there's a guy who's younger now, but it was just very addictive. You know, I love the travel. My typical weekend would be Saturday morning, get up for a really early flight out of London to a European capital, go to an expo, pick up my race number, run on Sunday morning, fly back, in the office on Monday, limping around a little bit. And people stopped asking after a while. They just assumed that I'd done another race. But it was just a really good way to see all these different places. And when I compared the weekends where you just go out to some clubs and have a load of booze, and they all blurred into one, compared to this, where in a year, I felt like I got a decade of memories. Because you could be in Rome one weekend, and then Paris the next, and then Prague the next. It was a really fun way of doing things. And often I do it with members of the running club. So there's also a social element to that you could, even if it was people I didn't know, I could then meet up with them there. On the website, there was a way that you could see what people were doing, and you just send an email around to all the people going to this exotic race and say, hey, why don't we meet up for dinner? And a good way to make new friends too.
And what did your friends and family think of this once you got rolling full into it?
Well, at that point, more of my friends became runners. So they thought it was pretty normal. But the family, I mean, we'd always been a sporty family. My brother's a bodybuilder. My sister was very sporty as well. So dad is in his 70s now, but has played tennis his whole life. So the idea of doing a sport a lot was not that unusual. The running side of it was not really what they did, but it wasn't totally out of the blue that they were all couch potatoes and then I was the one person doing any exercise.
I was looking through kind of your accolades and the list of all the races that you've done. Is there one in particular that like really sticks out that you're most proud of?
Probably one group. So that in 2013, I did something called the Grand Slam of Ultrarunning, which is 4 of the original 100 milers. So there were about 600 milers that are now about 30 to 40 years old. The first one was Western States, which is also considered to be the most prestigious race. It's just outside Lake Tahoe in California. So it basically involves doing these 4 races in one summer, and then you add up the time, and that's called the Grand Slam of Ultrarunning. And so I did that after I'd done a few years of 100 milers, and I set the record for it. But I had a very close competition back and forth with a good friend of mine who's also a Brit American who lives in Colorado. So he and I were going back and forth in each of these races, and we both were well under the record, and it came down to the final race. So that's probably the biggest thing. 'Cause it's the hardest I've ever done, hardest summer ever, because you do one massive race and then 2 or 3 weeks later you have to do another one, then another one, then another one. So it was mentally exhausting, but also, you know, that's the whole point. This is something I'm in for the challenge, and that was a big challenge. So I like, in fairness, just as much the challenge from doing the racing as I do from the business side of things. So those two things balance each other out quite well. And it's not like I'm all in on one of them. I mean, I do this so I can run more, but it's also that I enjoy the challenge of how do you run a business and how do you make a living from something you love.
Going back to the business side a little bit, how is the transition into coaching as well. I know a lot of times, people that get involved in a field that they're passionate about, sometimes they struggle not enjoying it as much as the actual process of running itself versus coaching. So how is that kind of integration into that field for you?
Well, I made sure that I was still prioritizing the fact that I wanted to be able to run and have the flexibility to do that. So because everything I do is online, I can be anywhere I need to be. And so if I need to go up to a race 2 weeks in advance, I can do all my work from there and not have to worry about taking vacation time or getting permission to do this or that. I can work just as much, and as long as it's somewhere with Wi-Fi, basically. So sometimes it has to be a bit off the grid, and that is a bit of downtime. But I prioritize that I'm doing this so that I can enjoy the sport that I wanted to have more time to do. And so that factors into how hard I'd work and other things. But I also wanted to make sure that the core period for my ability to run well, which was in my 30s, I'm now 41, was also the period I had to build a business, because that's when I would have free marketing, winning races or being in magazines. That is the best way to build a brand for myself and to actually have a career in this. While if I just did all the running and minimal work, and then at the end of that tried to build a coaching business, it's much harder to get people's attention if they no longer know who you are. So I was very conscious that I had to work very hard, and I definitely worked a lot more hours and a lot harder during my 30s than during my 20s in the corporate job. So I think a lot of people who are self-employed would probably say that they end up working longer hours, but I was also conscious that I didn't want that to be longer hours forever. That was really just to build up a business that would be sustainable and to be in the position for the long term that I can keep doing this without having to worry about, did I win a race this year? And if not, I have no business.
Was growing the brand and the business side going to your expectations of how quickly you thought it would grow? Was it harder than you expected, or what was that process like for you?
It was certainly hard, but I wouldn't say it's harder than I expected. It was hard work, but it went extremely well. I mean, I've built up a position now where I have a group of other coaches who work with me, who are all, some of them are world champions. One of them's an Olympian. We've got a really prestigious group of very excellent ultra runners, some of the best in the business. That builds on itself. So it's also trying to think about what is going to build momentum within a sustainable business. So that means we add to each other, basically. So the fact that we each have our own degree of fame in this small area of ultra running, it allows us then to gain from the credibility of each other, and also to kind of have a first mover advantage that we're the only company that really does this globally. And so anyone who wanted to do it, they're more likely to come and ask to work for me than to do it themselves, because it's so difficult to establish a group of people with that much credibility. So it was very much a purposeful thought process there about what will work best from a business perspective. Plus, they're all people that I know and trust. So unlike most businesses where you have to hire someone, you just read a resume. These are people I know. I know their reputation. I know them as a friend. I know what they've done. So I'm already aware of their history and the things they've achieved. So that also kind of is another aspect. It does mean there's that overlap between friend and contractor, not employee. But the key things, we're all in it together for each other's benefit, and we all understand that. So basically, I stumbled upon a really good business model and then made sure that I could maximize it and help all of us to have a long-term career.
The ultra marathon business in general, I know you're starting to see more documentaries in the space. I know you were in the documentary Once Is Enough that has been getting like a lot of popularity as well. Like, are you starting to see the industry grow as a whole, or is it pretty stable as it's been over the year? Like, where do you see it trending over the next 5 to 10 years?
I mean, it's been a massive growth industry anyway. So more and more people have been doing ultra running. Since I got into it, it was much smaller. I mean, it really took off about 10 or 15 years ago. And it's also an industry that tends to grow during recessions. So people might stop having their golf club membership, but they take up running. And we see this, for example, during the pandemic. A lot of people took up running during that. So even though many industries retracted, running and coaching expanded. So it's something that's countercyclical and is basically in the long term growing really fast. I mean, I didn't pick the industry because of that. It's very lucky that I picked something that is growing in popularity, and that makes my life easier. But it certainly is very helpful that the long term projections for that as well would be that it's still so small. I mean, there's only 100,000 or so people that do it in the US in a given year. And yet there's millions who do running of some sort. So there's a massive potential market there as well.
In terms of the coaching side of it, is there like a specific story or student that you're super inspired by that you've watched their progression?
To be honest, the great thing is that I get to see hundreds of people over the years, and almost every single one of them is. In fact, pretty much all of them are. That is the great thing about this job. And in my previous job, you do well and you maybe get a thank you, and that's about it in the corporate world. Here, if someone has a good race or they do something they've never achieved before, they are ecstatic. It's life-changing for them. And they really giving you that kind of feedback and that happiness and enjoyment. So I get to kind of live vicariously through these other runners as well. So whether it is someone doing their first time at a race or someone who is like a world champion or at absolute top levels, it's all equally as fun. And I get to live all of that through them. So it's very exciting for me. I wouldn't say there's one in particular that stands out, because it's a sport where every part of it, by definition, is about going to your limits. So every single time someone does something, it's usually well beyond maybe what they imagined initially. And that's how it was for me. I mean, I first got into running and thought, if I ever run a 3-hour marathon, that'll be amazing. Then you do that. And can I ever run a 2:45? And then can I run a 2:20? And you change the benchmark, but you never know where that's going to be, of how high you can get. And I certainly never thought I'd make a living out of it. But I see this across all the runners that I'm coaching, that when they do something bigger than they thought, then it is quite literally life-changing, because then they reassess what they can do in other parts of their life as well. And it's very enjoyable for them. I mean, there's a lot of suffering and difficult parts to it. But as with most things in life, the harder it is, the more satisfying it is to then complete it.
How do you see the business progressing over the next 5 years? Do you see the industry changing at all? Are you going to focus on more coaching or more races, or where do you see it going?
To be honest, I'd say it's not dissimilar to any other business of the things you have to be thinking about. So you're thinking about how technology is changing. In the last couple of years, we've changed the way the coaching platform we use to be more high tech and have automatic uploads from watches and things like that. There'll definitely, I think, be continuing growth. And a lot of that growth is people coming into the sport who are very keen to have a coach, because there's a steep learning curve. So that they're the kind of people who it's best to work with, because there's so much for them to learn. And a coach can really get them much further along that process than just the trial and error that I did for myself originally. Yeah, I mean, it's about trying to think, what will be the business landscape in 5 years, 10 years? What are my contractors needing? I mean, like any business, you're just trying to look at all the risks and all the opportunities at all times, and make sure you're not going to miss out on something or realize too late that you should have changed something. But the fundamentals of it, I'd say, would be fairly similar over the coming years. One thing that people might think about within this industry as being a big tech challenge is that we see more and more things where there's an app that will automate things for you, or it'll get your data from your watch and tell you exactly how you should do things. But as with most AI stuff, it is not nearly as good as experience, and it's decades away from a point where you can have basically a combination of a therapist and someone who can understand all the different personalities of different people, as well as the training knowledge and the feedback from devices, given that you need more than just one device, like just heart rate and other stuff. You need the whole picture about the person, how are they feeling, all these other things. So that's one technology that we want to take advantage of to get more information and to make us better coaches. But it's not like this is an industry that's going away anytime soon, because anything that involves a lot of empathy and discussion and consulting type stuff, you can't just turn that into an algorithm.
I always like to end it with a question just about, for someone out there who's thinking about quitting a job or recently quit a job, what's a piece of advice that you would give them based on like your experience over the years?
I would say the biggest thing is, especially if you're not enjoying where you are or where you can see it going in the future, then really think, what would you enjoy and how could you get to that point? So I had a very deliberate thought process of, what do I want my life to look like and how would I make it be like that? And it wasn't doing that job that was stressful and too long hours and I didn't see a future in it for me. But you know that there's going to be risk, know that there'll be a drop in salary. You're going to have a period where you'll probably have to live off savings, but it's worth it for where you can get to. It's just making that leap is very difficult to do, especially because most people wouldn't even want to have a 10% pay cut. So if you potentially go down to zero income for the next year because you're working on things, or maybe you're spending a lot of money on various things, like I don't have a physical business, so I don't have to worry about a warehouse and a storefront and stuff like that. So it's a very low cost business. It's all internet based. But for most people, you're going to have a lot of investment there, maybe bank loans. So you really want to think through that business model of how would it actually get to being feasible for the long term, and what would it require for that without being unrealistic. But it's totally worth the leap. If you switch to something that you enjoy more and have more control over it, I would recommend that to anyone. And as part of my job, I often am speaking to people and they're maybe not happy in their jobs. And so they're thinking about changing it, not just so they can fit in their running better, but because it's not the thing they want to be as part of their life, particularly if they've been working insane hours and their boss is not a very good person to work for. And so, that's something I do talk to people about and say, well, is this the job for you? Is there the same job in the industry you could switch to with a better boss? And that would also be a thing to consider. If you're not liking your job, could you do the same job somewhere else? Because that is a much easier move. And then maybe you will like it. But if that industry and that work is not what you're liking, then finding something you do enjoy more is well worth it. But it could take quite a while to get to where you need to be.
What's the next race? Where are you off to next?
This one is a month today, actually. It's a 100-miler in Arizona. Just some loops outside of Phoenix, basically. So it's just an easier start to the year. Not a big competitive one, but just I haven't done as many 100-milers in the last couple of years because of the pandemic.
Well, 100 miles doesn't sound easy to me, but I definitely appreciate your time. Wish you the best of luck with it. And excited to see what you do moving forward.
Cheers, Dave. Thanks.
Thank you for listening. It really means a lot to us. We want to hear from you as we keep going. Please reach out on whyiquit.co with any feedback or if you have any guests that you think would be a good fit. Subscribe on whyiquit.substack.com to get an update every Wednesday with the newest guest. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube to get notified with the latest episodes. Also, a special thanks to Chris Dole for the music. Check out his newest album, Here's to You. Thank you, and we will be back next Wednesday.